The sound of Arden Crowley's footsteps echoed in the dark, hollow hallway of the factory, a sound so loud it felt like it could wake the dead. But there was no one here to hear it. No one but the machines. And the machines, well, they didn't care. They never did. The factory loomed in the distance, its silhouette a jagged mass against the moonless sky. It was a place that no one spoke about openly, not in the daylight, not in the town. It was just there, a dark, foreboding shadow that stretched across the horizon. But for Arden, desperate for work, the factory was an opportunity, a chance to escape the crushing weight of poverty. They had heard the rumors, of course, the strange stories whispered behind closed doors about the place, about what happened to the workers who stayed too long. But those were just stories. Arden didn't believe in ghost stories. Not anymore. The factory's iron gates creaked open, and Arden stepped inside. The air was thick, oppressive, as if it had been holding its breath for years. The metallic scent of rust and decay hung heavy in the air, mingling with something darker, something almost alive. The wind howled through the empty yard, but the factory itself stood still, unmoving. It felt like the building was watching them, like the very walls were aware of their presence. Arden shook the thought away. It was just nerves. Inside, the factory was a maze of narrow, winding hallways, each one darker than the last. The walls were scarred, covered in grime and years of neglect. The flickering overhead lights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to move when they weren't being looked at. The air was stale, thick with the smell of oil, metal, and something else. Something sharp, like blood. The hum of machines reverberated through the walls, a low, guttural sound that made Arden's skin crawl. It wasn't the sound of a factory. It was the sound of something alive, something that was waiting. At the front desk, a woman sat, her face pale and her eyes distant. Maris Eldridge, the receptionist. She didn't look up when Arden approached, her fingers moving slowly across the surface of a worn-out ledger. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft, almost robotic. "Welcome to the factory," she said, her tone flat, her eyes never meeting Arden's. "You must follow the rules. It's important." Arden raised an eyebrow. "The rules?" they asked, confused. "What rules?" Maris's gaze lifted just enough to meet Arden's eyes. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at them, something cold, like she wasn't seeing them at all. "The rules," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Follow them, and you'll be fine. Break them, and the factory will take care of you." Arden's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They couldn't tell if Maris was serious or if this was some strange form of factory superstition. But the way she said it, the way her voice trembled ever so slightly, Arden couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Maris handed Arden a thick stack of papers, each one covered in strange, cryptic rules. Some were typical, like don't touch the machines, don't wander the halls alone, but others were disturbing. Never ask about the souls, one rule read, always leave before the last bell rings. Arden frowned, flipping through the pages, their unease growing with every word. "Just follow the rules," Maris said again, her voice almost pleading. "The factory is watching. It always knows." Arden nodded, trying to ignore the feeling of dread creeping over them. They had heard the rumors about the workers, how they were strange, how they never spoke, how they seemed to be empty. But none of that mattered. They had a job to do. They needed the money. As Arden made their way to the production floor, the factory seemed to close in around them. The machines hummed louder now, the sound vibrating through the floor, through the walls, through their very bones. It was as if the factory itself was alive, breathing, watching. The workers, Talon Brack, Vesper Quinn, and Cyrus Dredd, moved like automatons, their faces blank, their eyes glazed over. They didn't speak. They didn't acknowledge Arden's presence. They just worked. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. Arden's stomach twisted with unease. The air was thick with the smell of metal, of something burning, of something wrong. It felt like the factory was closing in on them, like it was swallowing them whole. The walls seemed to pulse with each beat of the machines, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and writhe, like they were alive. Arden couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. But when they looked around, there was no one there. Just the workers, moving in their strange, robotic patterns. Every now and then, one of the workers would glance up at Arden. their eyes empty, hollow, as if they weren't really seeing anything at all. And every time, Arden felt a shiver run down their spine, a deep, gnawing fear that they couldn't explain. It was like the factory itself was alive, and it was waiting for something, or someone. As the shift dragged on, Arden couldn't escape the feeling that they were being pulled into something darker, something they didn't fully understand. The machines, the workers, the rules, they were all part of something that felt far too dangerous to ignore. But Arden was too deep in now. They couldn't turn back. Just as Arden was about to leave for the day, they heard it. A soft, ghostly whisper, so faint that they almost missed it. "Don't break the rules." Arden froze, their heart pounding in their chest. They spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the factory silent except for the hum of the machines. Arden's breath caught in their throat. Had they imagined it? Or was it real? The feeling of being watched intensified, the oppressive atmosphere of the factory closing in around them. Arden's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before they could think too much about it, the clock rang, signaling the end of their shift. They hurried out of the factory, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls, the whisper still lingering in their ears. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit their face, but it didn't bring the relief they expected. The factory loomed behind them, its windows dark and lifeless, but something about it felt alive. Something was wrong, and Arden couldn't shake the feeling that they were already in too deep to turn back. The rules, the strange workers, the whisper, it was all connected, and Arden had only just begun to realize how much danger they were truly in. Arden's unease only deepened with each passing day at the factory. At first, they had tried to push the strange occurrences to the back of their mind, but they couldn't ignore them anymore. The machines had started to feel too alive. The hum of the machines was no longer just a background noise. It was a constant, pulsing vibration that seemed to resonate in their bones. The factory had a way of getting under their skin, of making them feel as though something was always watching. The rules, too, weighed heavier on them now. Every day, they felt the oppressive pressure of the do's, don'ts, and don'ts that governed their every move. And yet, it wasn't just the rules that had begun to unsettle them. It was the souls. They had first dismissed them as nothing more than part of the factory's process. The glowing orbs that floated in the air, the way they pulsed and flickered like they were alive, seemed like a natural part of the machinery. But soon, Arden began to notice something strange. The souls weren't just glowing. They were moving. They reached out with invisible hands, their faint whispers echoing in the air. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft murmur that seemed to come from nowhere. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Arden would catch glimpses of the souls, their faint outlines shimmering in the corners of their vision. They would turn, and the souls would vanish, only to reappear moments later, closer, as if they were watching them. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The souls weren't just lifeless objects. They were alive, conscious, aware. They were trying to communicate, but Arden couldn't understand what they were saying. And no one else seemed to notice. The workers, the ones who had been at the factory far longer than Arden, went about their tasks as though nothing unusual was happening. Talon Brack, Vesper Quinn, and Cyrus Dredd. They all seemed oblivious to the soul's presence, as though they were part of the factory's strange machinery. But Arden couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something far darker than they could comprehend. The factory's rules, too, seemed to grow more oppressive with each passing day. Don't ask about the souls. That was the rule that stuck with Arden the most. It was a simple rule, but it carried a weight that felt suffocating. Every time they tried to ask about the souls, they were met with silence, or worse, vague, unsettling responses. "Don't worry about it," Nat Talon would say, his eyes flickering nervously as if he were hiding something. Vesper would simply stare at them, her face blank, her lips pressed into a thin line. And Cyrus? Cyrus just smiled, a cold, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was during one of these long, sleepless nights, when the factory was quieter than usual, that Arden first encountered the Hollow Soul. They had stayed behind after their shift, unable to shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The factory was dark now, the machines silent, and the only light came from the dim glow of the souls that floated in the air. Arden wandered the hallways, trying to make sense of it all. The factory felt like a maze, a place that twisted and turned in on itself. Every hallway seemed to lead to another hallway. Every door seemed to open into a room that shouldn't exist. And then they saw it. A figure, barely more than a wisp, standing in the corner of one of the storage rooms. It was transparent, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. The figure was barely visible, a ghostly silhouette against the shadows. Arden's heart skipped a beat as they stepped closer, their breath catching in their throat. The figure was wrong. It wasn't like the other souls. It wasn't glowing. It wasn't alive. It was dead. The hollow soul. It turned to face Arden, its hollow eyes staring at them with an intensity that sent a chill down their spine. The soul didn't speak at first, but the air around it seemed to vibrate with a low hum, a sound that made Arden's skin crawl. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, the hollow soul spoke. "Leave," it said, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "Leave before it's too late." Arden froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The words hung in the air like a curse, heavy and oppressive. The hollow soul's eyes glowed faintly, its form flickering as though it was struggling to maintain its shape. It took a step forward, its presence like a weight pressing down on Arden's chest. "The factory doesn't just make souls," the hollow soul continued, its voice growing fainter, like it was being pulled away. "It traps them. It turns them into husks, empty shells, things that can never escape. You don't understand. You don't know what they're doing here." Arden's mind raced, trying to process what they had just heard. What was the hollow soul talking about? What was the factory really doing? The rules, the whispers, the strange workers. It was all connected, but Arden couldn't make sense of it. They wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but before they could speak, the hollow soul vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone, leaving nothing but a cold emptiness in its wake. Arden stood there for a long time, frozen in place, the factory's silence pressing down on them like a vice. The weight of the warning hung in the air, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The hollow soul's words echoed in their mind, and Arden couldn't help but wonder, was it too late to leave? The factory had a hold on them now. It was in the air, in the machines, in the souls that floated around them. The more Arden tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to pull them in. The workers, Talon, Vesper, Cyrus, they all seemed to be under the factory's control, moving like puppets on strings. And the souls were alive, reaching out, whispering. Arden's paranoia grew with each passing day. They saw figures in the shadows, glimpses of movement out of the corner of their eye. The factory seemed to be closing in on them, its walls shifting, its halls twisting. The machines hummed louder, and the air grew thicker, heavier. The rules became more oppressive, more suffocating. Every time they asked about the souls, they were met with silence, or worse, vague answers that only deepened the mystery. And then one day, it happened. Arden was walking down the hallway when they felt a hand on their shoulder. They spun around, their heart racing, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. But as they turned back, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Talon Brack was standing in the doorway of one of the storage rooms, his eyes dark, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have listened to it," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. Arden took a step back, confused and terrified. "What do you mean?" they asked, their voice trembling. Talon's eyes flickered with something unnatural, something dark. And then, without warning, he shoved Arden out of the room, his hands cold and unyielding. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his voice tinged with something almost cruel. Arden stumbled back, their mind racing. What was Talon trying to tell them? What did he mean? The factory was no longer just a place of work. It was a prison. And Arden was trapped inside. The factory had always been a place of mystery. But now, with each passing day, Arden felt the dark weight of its secrets closing in on them. The machines hummed, the souls glowed faintly in the distance, and the workers moved like shadows, their eyes empty and lifeless. Arden couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The warnings, the strange rules, the hollow soul. It all pointed to something sinister. But what? Arden had to know. They couldn't just keep going, blindly following the rules, pretending everything was normal. So, one night, when the factory was quiet, Arden decided to search for answers. They had to find out what was really going on behind those walls. The deeper they ventured into the factory, the more unsettling it became. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It was like the factory itself was alive, shifting around them. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on their chest, and the hum of the machines seemed to get louder the further they went. Finally, after what felt like hours of wandering, Arden found something. A door, hidden behind a stack of crates half covered in dust. It was locked, but Arden's heart raced as they fumbled with the key they had stolen earlier. The lock clicked open, and the door creaked as it swung wide. Inside was a room that sent a chill through Arden's bones. It was filled with mechanical devices, wires, tubes, and strange glowing machines that hummed with a life of their own. But what really made Arden's stomach drop was what they saw in the center of the room. Souls. But not the kind of souls Arden had seen before. These were different. They were trapped, suspended in glass containers, their forms flickering and twisting as though they were alive. Arden stepped closer, their breath catching in their throat. The souls weren't glowing peacefully like the ones in the factory's main hall. They were struggling, writhing in pain, trying to break free from the glass. And the machines, they were the ones keeping them in place. Arden's mind raced as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The souls weren't being created. They were being harvested, extracted from their human hosts, stripped of their life force, and turned into something else. Something mechanical. Something empty. Arden's stomach churned. This wasn't a factory that made souls. It was a factory that harvested them. And what was worse, it seemed like the factory was using the souls to power its machines, to fuel whatever dark purpose it had. A cold shiver ran down Arden's spine. They had to get out of here. They had to warn someone. But who could they trust? Everyone seemed to be under the factory's control, including the workers. Talon, Vesper, Cyrus, they all seemed so lifeless, so distant. What if they were just like the souls in the machines? What if they were trapped too, and didn't even know it? Arden tried to confide in Vesper the next day, hoping she would understand. But when they found her, standing by one of the machines, her face expressionless, she simply stared at them blankly. "You're worrying too much," she said, her voice flat. "There's nothing wrong here. You're just new. You'll get used to it." Arden's heart sank. Vesper's words were so calm, so detached, as though she had said them 1,000 times before. It was like she didn't even care. And when Arden asked about the souls, she just shook her head, her lips curling into a tight, almost pitying smile. "Don't ask about the souls," she said, her voice low, like a warning. "It's not our place to question." The words sent a wave of unease through Arden. It was the same response they had gotten from everyone else. The workers, Talon, Vesper, Cyrus, they all seemed to be saying the same thing. Don't ask, don't question, just follow the rules. But Arden couldn't stop. They had to know what was really going on. They had to understand why the factory was doing this, why the souls were being harvested and trapped. What was the purpose? That night, as Arden wandered the halls again, trying to piece together what they had learned, they ran into the Overseer. The Overseer was the factory's leader, the one who kept everything running smoothly. Arden had only seen them from a distance before, but now, face to face, the Overseer's cold, emotionless gaze sent a shiver through their spine. The Overseer was tall, dressed in a black suit, their face obscured by a shadow that seemed to follow them wherever they went. "What are you doing here?" the Overseer asked, their voice calm, yet somehow filled with authority. Arden hesitated, trying to find the right words. I want to understand. What is this place? What are we really doing here?" The Overseer's lips curled into a faint, almost amused smile. "This factory is necessary," they said, their voice as cold as steel. "It maintains balance. The souls are merely products. They are extracted, refined, and repurposed. It's how the world works. You shouldn't question it." Arden felt a knot tighten in their stomach. But the souls, what happens to them? Why are they trapped like that? The Overseer's smile faded, and for a brief moment, their eyes seemed to flash with something darker. "You don't need to worry about that," they said, their tone suddenly colder. "The process is not for you to understand. Just follow the rules, and you'll be fine." Arden took a step back, feeling the weight of the Overseer's words pressing down on them. The factory was more than just a place of work. It was a machine, a dark, twisted machine that harvested souls for reasons Arden couldn't yet comprehend. And the overseer was at the heart of it all, pulling the strings, controlling everything. Arden's mind raced, but before they could say anything more, the overseer turned and walked away, their shadow swallowing them whole. But just as Arden thought they might have a chance to escape, they were pulled into a small, dark room by Cyrus Dread. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't have asked," he whispered urgently, looking around as though he feared someone might be listening. "You're part of it now. You've been chosen. Your soul is already being harvested." Arden's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" they asked, their voice barely a whisper. Cyrus stepped closer, his breath shallow. "The factory doesn't just make souls. It creates them, it traps them, and it uses them. You're becoming one of us. You're becoming part of the process." Arden's mind spun. They wanted to scream, to run, but their body felt heavy, like it was no longer their own. They could feel something inside them shifting, something cold and dark, and they realized with horror that Cyrus wasn't lying. The factory had already begun to claim them. "You're already changing," Cyrus said, his voice trembling. "It's too late. You're part of the factory now." Arden's breath quickened, panic rising in their chest. They had to get out. They had to escape before it was too late. But as they turned to leave, they felt a sharp pain in their chest, as though something was pulling at their very soul. The factory was taking them, slowly, relentlessly, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Arden woke up one morning feeling different. The air in the factory felt heavier, thicker, and it seemed to press against them, making it hard to breathe. Their body felt strange, like it didn't belong to them anymore. At first, it was just a small thing, a slight ache in their muscles that wouldn't go away, but soon it grew worse. Every step felt like they were dragging themselves through quicksand, every movement slower, more deliberate. Their hands shook as they tried to work, but no matter how hard they tried to focus, the exhaustion wouldn't leave. It was like their own body was betraying them, slipping away piece by piece. The worst part was the memories. At first, it was just little things. They couldn't remember what they had for breakfast or what their favorite song was. Then it was bigger things. Details about their life, their family, their past, slipping away like sand through their fingers. The more time passed, the less Arden could remember. It was like their entire life before the factory was being erased, replaced with something darker, something that didn't belong to them. The rules of the factory, the ones they had once questioned, started to feel more like commands. At first, they had followed them out of fear, but now it was different. They followed them without even thinking. Don't touch the machines. Don't ask about the souls. Never leave the factory grounds. The rules were no longer something Arden consciously obeyed. They were becoming a part of them. They followed them without even realizing it, like their body was moving on its own, obeying some invisible force that controlled them. And that force was the factory itself. It was getting harder to remember what it felt like to be free. What was it like before the factory? Was there ever a time when they weren't here, trapped in this place? The questions twisted inside Arden's mind, but they couldn't find the answers. All they knew was that the factory was becoming everything. It was their life now, their purpose, their reason for existing. And the longer they stayed, the more they felt like they were becoming one of the machines. They were becoming like the workers, empty, hollow, and lifeless. As the days passed, Arden began to see the true horror of the factory. It wasn't just a place where souls were harvested. It was a place where souls were tortured, twisted into new forms, and used as labor. The workers, once human, were now nothing more than shells of themselves. Their eyes were empty, their movements mechanical, their personalities erased. They did their jobs without question, without emotion, without thought. They were no longer people. They were just parts of the factory functioning like machines. And Arden could feel themselves slipping into the same state. It was hard to tell where the factory ended and where they began. The walls of the factory seemed to shift and change, like the place was alive, breathing with them. The machines hummed louder every day, their noise growing more deafening. The souls that once glowed with a faint light were now dark, twisted, their forms flickering and writhing in agony. They cried out, but no one could hear them. No one cared. The factory fed on them, drained them of their essence, and turned them into something else, something that wasn't human. Arden tried to escape. They had to. They couldn't stay here any longer. But every time they tried to leave, they were blocked. The hallways twisted, leading them in circles, trapping them in an endless maze. No matter which way they turned, they always ended up back where they started. It was like the factory was alive, watching them, making sure they couldn't leave. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing thicker, suffocating them. And the souls, oh, the souls, they seemed to grow more desperate, their cries louder, their pain more intense. The factory was feeding off them, feeding off their fear, and it was growing stronger with each passing moment. The factory wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, feeding off the souls it trapped, feeding off the fear that filled the air. Arden could feel it now, deep inside them, like a presence that was always watching, always waiting. It was the factory, controlling everything, controlling them. They were nothing more than a cog in its machine, just another part of the process. And then one night, as Arden stumbled through the dark halls, they encountered the hollow soul again. It appeared out of nowhere, a wisp of smoke, barely more than a shadow in the darkness. Its voice was soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You're still here," it said, its voice filled with sorrow. "You should have left when you had the chance." Arden's heart pounded in their chest. "What's happening to me?" they asked, their voice trembling. "Why can't I escape?" The hollow soul's form flickered, its face twisted in pain. "The factory feeds on more than just souls," it said, its voice barely audible. "It feeds on fear. The more fear you feel, the stronger it becomes. The factory thrives on your fear, on your desperation. It's not just a place, it's a force, and you are part of it now." Arden's mind reeled. The factory wasn't just a building, it was alive. It was feeding on them, feeding on their fear, and the more they feared it, the stronger it became. And now, Arden was a part of it. There was no escaping it. There was no way out. They were trapped, just like the others, just like the souls. The hollow soul's voice grew fainter, like it was being pulled away. "You're already a part of the factory. There's no escape. There never was." And with that, the hollow soul disappeared, leaving Arden alone in the dark, their heart pounding in their chest. The factory was watching them, waiting for them to break, and it was only a matter of time before they did. Arden could feel it now, the fear, the desperation, growing inside them. The factory was feeding off it, and with each passing moment, it grew stronger. Arden was no longer just an employee. They were a part of the factory's twisted operation. They were becoming one of the workers, one of the hollow shells, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Arden had learned many things since their first day at the factory, but nothing could have prepared them for the final rule. It wasn't written on the walls or spoken aloud like the others. It was a truth that had slowly been creeping into their mind, a truth that now felt like a heavy weight on their chest. The final rule was simple, terrifying, and absolute. Never question the overseer. At first, Arden didn't understand what this meant. After all, they had questioned everything else: the machines, the souls, the strange workers, even the very existence of the factory itself. But now, as the weight of the rule settled into their bones, they realized that the overseer wasn't just a leader or a figurehead. The overseer was something far darker, something far more powerful. The overseer was the factory itself. They were the embodiment of it, a dark force that had existed for centuries, feeding on the souls it trapped and turning them into vessels for its own power. The factory wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a factory that made souls. It was alive, a living, breathing entity. And the souls it harvested were nothing more than tools, vessels to feed its endless hunger. The overseer was the heart of it all, the one who controlled everything, who kept the factory running. And the rule to never question the overseer wasn't just a warning, it was the key to the factory's operation. Without the overseer, the factory would collapse. Without the overseer, there would be no more souls to harvest. Arden felt the full weight of this truth, and it crushed them. They had spent so long questioning, so long trying to understand, but now they saw the truth for what it was. There was no escape. The factory was a machine, a dark, insidious machine that fed on souls, and the overseer was its master, its creator, its very life force. The factory had changed Arden. It had taken away their memories, their sense of self. Now it was trying to take their very soul. But Arden wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. They were desperate to resist, to break free from the factory's grip, but every time they tried, they were met with punishment. The factory seemed to react to their defiance, growing more oppressive with each passing moment. The walls seemed to close in on them, the machines hummed louder, and the souls, those twisted, hollow souls, seemed to scream louder in their ears. Arden's body felt heavy, their mind foggy. The more they resisted, the more they felt themselves slipping away, like they were being drawn into the very fabric of the factory. The workers, once passive and robotic, now seemed to be aware of their fate. They moved with a strange urgency, their eyes wide with terror, but they were powerless to act. They were trapped, just like Arden, bound by the same rules, the same unbreakable grip of the factory. It was then that the hollow soul appeared again, its form flickering in and out of existence like a dying ember. It whispered to Arden, its voice faint but clear. "You must accept your fate," it said, its voice filled with sorrow. "There is no escape. You cannot fight the factory. You cannot fight the overseer. The cycle will continue and you will be a part of it forever." Arden's heart raced as they listened. The hollow soul's words were a warning, but they were also a truth. There was no escape. The factory was a never-ending cycle, a machine that would continue to harvest souls and consume them for eternity. And Arden was now a part of it. They were trapped, just like the others. There was no way out. There never had been. But just as Arden was about to give in, to accept the reality of their fate, something strange happened. A new worker arrived at the factory. Her name was Lyra Vance, and she seemed different from the others. She moved with purpose, her eyes sharp and calculating. At first, Arden thought she was just another worker, another cog in the machine. But something about her felt off. There was an unnatural light in her eyes, something that Arden couldn't quite place. Lyra approached Arden one day, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. She smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, calculating, like she knew something Arden didn't. "I've been sent to help you," she said, her voice low and smooth. "You don't have to accept this. You don't have to be a part of this place." Arden felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark of resistance. Could Lyra be their way out? Could she be the key to breaking free from the factory's grip? But then, Arden saw it, the glow in Lyra's eyes. It wasn't normal. It wasn't human. It was the same unnatural glow they had seen in the overseer's eyes, the same eerie light that filled the factory itself. Arden's blood ran cold as the truth hit them. Lyra wasn't here to help. She was the overseer. She had to be. The realization struck Arden like a bolt of lightning. Lyra wasn't just a worker. She wasn't just a new arrival. She was the overseer in disguise, sent to keep Arden in line, to make sure they didn't break the final rule. Lyra was the factory's true form, its dark heart, and Arden had just walked straight into its trap. Lyra's smile widened, and for the first time, Arden saw the full extent of the overseer's power. "You should have listened," Lyra said, her voice now cold and hollow. "There is no escape. There never was." The factory hummed around them, its walls closing in, the machines growing louder. Arden felt the weight of the final rule pressing down on them, the unbreakable truth that had kept them trapped all this time. The overseer was not just a leader. The overseer was the factory itself, and the factory was alive. It fed on souls, it fed on fear, and it would never let go. Arden stood frozen, their body trembling with fear. They had resisted for so long, but now they understood the truth. There was no way out. There never had been. They were part of the factory now, just another cog in its endless machine. And no matter how hard they fought, no matter how hard they tried to escape, the factory would always win. Lyra's eyes glowed brighter, and Arden felt their body grow cold, their souls slipping away. The factory had won. It had claimed them, just like it had claimed all the others. And there was no escape. Arden stood frozen in front of Lyra, their heart racing, their minds swirling with terror and disbelief. The factory hummed around them, the machines vibrating with an unnatural energy. Lyra's smile had widened, but there was nothing kind or reassuring about it. There was only darkness, a darkness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. Arden's breath hitched as the truth began to sink in. Lyra wasn't just another worker. She was the overseer, the entity that had controlled this place for centuries. Lyra's voice was calm, almost soothing as she spoke. You've been asking the wrong questions, Arden. You've been trying to understand something that cannot be understood. This factory is not just a place, it's a living, breathing thing, and I'm its heart. I have been for as long as time itself has existed. The souls we create, the souls we consume, they are nothing but fuel for the factory. And now, you will be part of it. You'll help it grow. You'll feed it. Arden's stomach churned. The factory had always felt wrong, but now it was clear. The machines, the workers, the souls, they were all part of something much darker than Arden could have ever imagined. The overseer, the factory, the endless cycle of soul creation and consumption, it was all one twisted entity, feeding on fear, on suffering, on souls. You're lying, Arden whispered, though their voice trembled with doubt. I won't join you. I won't be part of this. Lyra's eyes glowed brighter, the light in them almost blinding. You don't have a choice, she said softly, almost pityingly. Your soul has already been altered. The moment you stepped into this factory, it began. You've already been marked. You're not the person you were when you first arrived, and now you belong to the factory. There's no going back. Arden's mind reeled. They could feel it now. The strange exhaustion, the sense of detachment from their own body. They had tried to resist, tried to fight the factory's pull, but it was too strong. The rules, the machines, the workers, they had all been designed to keep them in line, to keep them from realizing the truth. And now, the truth was undeniable. Arden was part of the factory. They were one of the souls that had been harvested, twisted, and turned into something else. The fear in Arden's chest grew, but so did the anger. They had been used, manipulated, but they weren't going to let it end like this. Arden clenched their fists, feeling the cold metal of the factory pressing against them. They had to fight back. They had to resist. I won't be your pawn, Arden shouted, their voice filled with defiance. I won't be part of your cycle. I'll destroy this place. I'll burn it to the ground. Lyra's laugh was cold, echoing through the factory like a hollow wind. You can't destroy it, she said, her voice low and filled with dark amusement. The factory is eternal. It's part of the very fabric of existence. It's not just a building. It's not just a machine. It's a force of nature. You can't kill it. You can't stop it. It will always be here, feeding, growing, creating, and now you're part of it. Arden's heart pounded in their chest as the weight of Lyra's words settled in. They had tried to destroy the factory before, but it had always fought back. The walls, the machines, the very air, they had all conspired to keep Arden trapped. And now Arden understood why. The factory wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it would never die. You're wrong, Arden said, their voice trembling but filled with determination. I'll find a way. I'll find a way to stop you. Lyra's eyes glowed brighter, her smile widening. There is no way, Arden. There never was. You are the overseer now. You're the one who will keep the cycle going. You're the one who will feed the factory. The soul you once were is gone. You are mine now. The words hit Arden like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of them. They had fought so hard, resisted for so long, but in the end, it had all been for nothing. The factory had already won. They had already been consumed, twisted into something else, something that could never escape. Arden had become the overseer's successor, the one who would continue the endless cycle of soul creation and consumption. Arden's vision blurred as the factory's power surged through them. They felt the pull, the dark force that had always been there, drawing them in, consuming them. They could feel the souls around them, trapped in the machines, their voices screaming in agony. They could feel their own soul slipping away, becoming just another part of the factory, just another cog in its endless machine. Lyra stepped forward, her presence overwhelming. You're mine now, she whispered, her voice like a caress. You will carry on my work. You will keep the factory alive. And when the time comes, you will find someone else to take your place. The cycle will never end. Arden's body trembled, their soul fighting to hold on, but it was useless. The factory had won. It had claimed them, just as it had claimed all the others before them. And now, Arden would become the overseer, the one who would keep the factory running for eternity. The machines hummed louder, the walls seemed to close in, and Arden realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. The factory was alive, and they were part of it now. The cycle would continue, and Arden would be its keeper, its ruler, its prisoner. The factory had claimed them, and there was no way out. Lyra's eyes glowed one last time, and Arden felt their souls slip away, consumed by the factory, becoming one with the endless cycle of soul creation and consumption. The factory had won, and now it would never stop. Arden stood at the center of the factory, their eyes glazed over, the weight of their new role settling heavily on their shoulders. The factory's hum was now a constant companion, a noise that filled their mind and body, vibrating through their very soul. They were the overseer now, the one who controlled the flow of souls, the one who ensured the factory's endless operation. The rules that had once seemed so strange and terrifying now felt like an instinct, an undeniable force that pushed them forward, making them part of the cycle they had once fought so hard to escape. The factory, vast and dark, stretched endlessly around them. The machines churned, their gears grinding and whirring, as they processed the souls that were fed into them. Arden watched with a detached curiosity as new workers arrived, just as they had once done. These new souls, so full of life and hope, had no idea what awaited them. They were brought in, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Some seemed confused, others frightened, but none could escape the pull of the factory. The hollow soul's warning echoed in Arden's mind like a ghostly whisper. The factory is eternal. You are now a part of it. Arden's heart twisted at the thought. They had become what they had feared most, a cog in the machine, a part of the endless cycle that would never stop. They had tried to resist, tried to fight, but now they were trapped just like the others. The factory had consumed them, body and soul, and there was no way out. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Arden walked the halls of the factory, their presence now a constant among the workers. They watched as the souls were harvested, twisted, and used, their bodies turned into lifeless shells that moved only because the factory willed it. There was no individuality, no freedom, just the factory's will. The workers were all the same, hollow, empty, and controlled. Arden's own reflection in the factory's cold, metallic walls no longer resembled the person they had once been. Their eyes were empty, their face expressionless, and their mind was a blur of confusion and fear. But something was changing. Arden could feel it, deep inside. The factory's influence was growing stronger, seeping into every part of them, twisting their thoughts and desires. They were no longer the person they had once been. They were part of the factory now, and the factory was part of them. The walls seemed to close in, the machines seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and Arden realized with a sickening certainty that they were no longer just the overseer. They were becoming one of the souls, the very thing they had once feared. It was then that Arden saw it, another batch of souls being processed. The machines hummed, the gears clicked, and the workers moved like puppets, their eyes empty and vacant. Arden's gaze fell on the souls being harvested, their faces contorted in fear and pain. They were new, fresh, full of life, but they would soon be twisted into the same hollow beings that Arden had become. As Arden watched, a cold realization gripped their heart. The hollow soul's words came rushing back, clearer than ever. You are now a part of it. Arden had always thought that they were the one in control, the one who ran the factory. But now they understood. They weren't in control. The factory was. And Arden wasn't just the overseer. They were the next soul to be consumed. The machines had already started their work. The factory had already begun to feed on Arden's soul, just as it had fed on so many others before. The realization hit them like a bolt of lightning. They were no longer the one who controlled the factory. They were the next victim, the next soul to be twisted and consumed. The cycle was never ending. The factory would continue, and Arden would become just another cog in the machine, another soul to be harvested and used. The horror of it all was overwhelming. Arden tried to scream, to fight, but it was too late. The factory had already claimed them. They were trapped in the endless cycle, just like all the others. The souls that had once been fresh and full of life were now just empty shells, and Arden was no different. They had become a part of the factory, and there was no escape. The machines hummed louder. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and Arden's body felt heavier with each passing moment. They could feel the factory's grip tightening around them, pulling them deeper into its dark, endless maw. There was no way out. The cycle would continue, and Arden would be the one to keep it going. The factory had won. The souls would keep coming, and Arden would keep feeding it, just as they had always done. The factory was eternal, and Arden was now a part of it.